Tough crowd. Good evening, everyone. All right, my name is Jonathan Gales. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Africana Studies here at Georgia State University, and I am excited about this kickoff lecture this evening. That's our kickoff lecture for our second Beyond the Culture conference. I want to thank our phenomenal partners, Auburn Avenue Research Library, and our good friend and colleague, Morris Gardner, who has been a phenomenal partner for us for many, many years. I want to recognize my friend and colleague, Lakita Burnett Bailey, who is the curator of this three-day event. And I'm going to get out of the way because we have a phenomenal presentation this evening. Before I go any further, I also want to thank the Consulate General of Canada in Atlanta and the government of Canada here for their support of this event. And please, if you can, attend our events tomorrow and Friday as the conference continues. And so now it's my job to introduce my good friend and colleague from Georgia State University, the one and only Dr. Professor, Right Reverend, he's not a reverend, but Dr. Professor Harcourt Fuller.
Dr. Gales, you're trying to get me in trouble. Greetings, bonjour. Happy Black History Month, everyone. I'm Dr. Harcourt Fuller. I'm a professor of history, African diasporic history at Georgia State University. I'm also the founder of the Black Money Exhibit, which is an exhibition that we launched here at the Auburn Avenue Research Library in 2018, 2019. And that exhibition has over 300 banknotes from over 80 plus countries and territories, and basically it represents about 10,000 years of Black history, lived experiences, and cultures. During Black History Month in 2019, the Black Money Exhibit was fortunate enough to partner with the Auburn Avenue Research Library and the Consulate General of Canada in Atlanta to host the closing reception of the exhibition right here in the gallery at Auburn Avenue Research Library. On that occasion, was the springboard for the first Viola Desmond lecture in commemoration of this trailblazing Black woman who was the first Canadian woman to appear on a regular circulating banknote. In 1946, Desmond, who was a successful businesswoman, was jailed for refusing to leave a whites-only area of the movie theater. Her court case inspired the pursuit of racial equality across Canada. She appears on the $10 bill, which was released by the Bank of Canada in November 2018, and which was exhibited at the Black Money Exhibit. If you've never seen it before, this is the $10 bill on which Viola Desmond appears, and this is a very significant banknote. There's so much information out there about Viola Desmond that you guys should know about. The theme of the inaugural Viola Desmond lecture in 2019 was Canada's Rosa Parks and other trailblazing Black Canadians. In addition to myself, the panelists for that Viola Desmond lecture included several other notable Canadians. The Honorable Nadia Theodore, Consul General of Canada in Atlanta at the time, was present. Nadia is currently serving her country as Ambassador of Canada to the World Trade Organization, and she's also the permanent representative of Canada to the Permanent Mission of Canada in Geneva, Switzerland. Also present in 2019 was Dr. Melinda Smith, former professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta. Dr. Smith is currently the inaugural Vice Provost of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Calgary. And last but not least, also present in 2019 was Aita Sado, author, storyteller, and owner of Toronto's Blackhurst Cultural Center, formerly known as a Different Book List Cultural Center. We would like to thank the Consulate General of Canada in Atlanta, the Government of Canada, the Auburn Avenue Research Library, and the following GSU departments and programs: the Department of Africana Studies, the Department of Political Science, the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology, the Center for Studies on Africa and its Diaspora, the Department of English, and the Amos Chair Endowment for partnering to bring us the 4th annual Viola Desmond Lecture. I have the honor and pleasure to introduce this evening's keynote speaker, Dalton Higgins, who will present on the topic, Drake and the New Hip-Hop World. Please allow me to introduce our speaker tonight. Dalton Higgins is a publicist, author of 6 books, National Magazine award-winning journalist, and Toronto Metropolitan University's Music-Prof-in-Residence. Higgins teaches the popular university course, Deconstructing Drake and the Weeknd, that has been featured on CNN, the New York Times, NPR, and BET, among many other media outlets. His best-selling book includes Far From Over, The Music and Life of Drake, which is carried in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum Collection in Cleveland, and Hip Hop World, which has been carried in Harvard University's Hip Hop Archive since 2009. Higgins' pioneering work in the area of global music research and event production has taken him to several countries: Denmark, France, Australia, Germany, Colombia, England, Curacao, Spain, Cuba, and across Canada, and right here in the United States. As the owner of an independent boutique publicity company, Higgins' roster includes clients that have won Grammy Awards, BET Awards, Emmy Awards, the Mercury Prize in the United Kingdom, and the French Grammy in France, as well as Juno Awards in Canada. As a longtime journalist, Higgins recently co-produced the New York Festival's award-winning This Is Not a Drake podcast series, which explores the evolution of hip-hop and gender dynamics within the culture. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please join me in giving a warm Hotlanta welcome to Dalton Higgins. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Okay. All right, so how's everybody doing today?
Great.
No, come on. This is not, you can do better than that. This is not Salt Lake City, Utah. With all due respect to Salt Lake City, how's everybody doing today?
We're great.
Okay, awesome. So before I get started, I would personally like to thank the Department of Africana Studies at Georgia State University and the Consulate General of Canada in Atlanta for bringing me out here from cold, chilly, freezing Toronto. It is freezing in Toronto, quite literally. And when we talk about Toronto, I was actually born and bred in Toronto, but I do consider myself a global citizen. So as you'll notice in Harcourt's introduction, I've kind of been around the block, around the globe, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I would also like to say that in me being born and bred in Toronto, if you ever get a chance to visit Toronto, I think it would be very much worth your while. Here are some factoids that you might find interesting. Toronto is the most multicultural city in the world, okay? So when you're attending school there, public school, college, university, it's like a miniature United Nations, right? So you go to school there. My classes, I grew up in downtown Toronto. There are kids from Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, Eastern European, continental African, the Caribbean, and it goes on and on. Latin America, this is pretty normal for us coming out of Toronto. And also, too, it is also the 4th largest city in North America. Okay, so next to New York, LA, Chicago, then it's Toronto. So we have a very large population, right? So it means it's good for business, right? And, certainly one of my obsessions is studying and celebrating Black culture, Black music in particular. And we actually host North America's largest celebration of Caribbean culture, an event called Caravana, or Toronto International. It's called the Toronto Caribbean Carnival now. And I like to describe it to local Atlantans like it's like a more sterile Freaknik. Replace the R&B and hip-hop with soca, calypso, reggae, and dancehall, right? Also, at the end of my talk, I want to open up the floor. There's not a day, week, minute, second that goes by where people aren't asking me, queries about Drake and the Weeknd, because Drake is the most influential musician on the planet, which we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to open up the floor for some questions. All right? Okay, now to get started, so the first time I came to Atlanta was actually 20 years ago. And it was in 2003. And I'd come here as a journalist to report, to cover the NBA All-Star Game. And it was actually Michael Jordan's last All-Star Game, so it was quite the moment, and I can remember it like it was yesterday. I got to see his, him play and do his thing. And now the theme of today's lecture, it's tied to some of the hip-hop world outside of Atlanta, to include Canada and different parts of the world, where the most popular rapper in the world resides, which is Toronto, Canada. But before I begin, I just wanted to share with you some anecdotes from the first time I came to Atlanta 20 years ago, right? Because it was pretty eye-opening. So our local hosts, we show up to cover the All-Star Game, interview players and managers, general managers, and some agents. And our hosts were these two well-known hip-hop journalists born and bred Atlantans. And once we touched down, I remember asking them if they could take me to or point me to Martin Luther King Jr. Historic District, to check out some history, some rich, deep histories of one of the greatest activists of all time, if not the greatest. And I remember one of our hosts, who shall remain nameless, saying something along the lines of, he said, "Yeah, okay, Martin Luther King, we'll have you go check out some of the historic district, but brother, have you ever been to Magic City?" All right, so this brother now, he was talking about, I guess, his gentleman's club, and like it was a rites of passage if you come to Atlanta. He'd refer to Magic City like it was the promised land, all right? Now, coming out of Canada, outside of Atlanta, outside of America, that culture just does not exist. As far as gentleman clubs and its close links to popular culture, athletes in this case, and music. I had conducted the first interview. I wrote for the Source magazine for 9 years. The Source magazine was at one point in time considered the Bible of hip-hop culture. And it was much the same thing in some parts of the Midwest and Detroit, is that a lot of the creativity, innovation, and some of the inventors of, different production styles, they hung out in gentlemen's clubs. I think there's a thesis to be had there, to be honest, right? Jay Dilla, who's arguably considered one of the top 5 producers of all time, that's where he derived his inspiration. He was in gentlemen's clubs. Okay. Anyways, at the time, I didn't get to go to the MLK memorial sites that year, and I have actually been back to Atlanta a couple times for basketball tournaments with my son. But I do endeavor to. This time around, I promise you, I'm going to get out to those sites. All right. All right. Now, basically, that year was also significant for me as a writer of the Source magazine, in that I got to go out to Miami and cover the Source Hip Hop Awards. And the highlight of the night back then, 20 years ago, was they had this Dirty South medley that featured Little John and the East Side Boys, Bone Crusher, Yin Yang Twins from here. And they all hit the stage and killed it. That was one of the highlights of the Source Awards. Now, I am also hoping one day that someone writes a book about the Source Awards, because before all the reported fights and brawls and chairs and punches being thrown, and essentially every single stereotype that we've been trying to run away from was reinforced, there was actually a functioning red carpet and a reasonable attempt to stage a credible award show, okay? Because when people hear the Source Awards, it's brawls, fights, chaos, Nevertheless, I'm thrilled to be in Atlanta. I've had a chance to check out a couple things the last couple days, and it's interesting whenever I attend music conferences outside of Canada, I'm always delighted to meet black scholars, racialized scholars of color, because what happens, despite me being in Toronto, which is the most multicultural city on the planet, outside of Toronto, it's quite homogenous. It's very, European, white. And sometimes I'll go to music conferences in Canada, and the only things that are black or of color are sometimes, the stage curtains, the seating in Canada. It's that bad. It lacks diversity, when it comes to music conferences. Nevertheless, as far as hip-hop world, I want to talk a lot about sort of the Drake, his journey, his trajectory, and how he essentially became the #1 artist on the planet as far as when you look at any hard statistical data, measures of success, which would be sales, streaming numbers. The first line in my 2009 book called Hip Hop World is that it's a hip hop world and you are all just living in it, all right? And what I meant by that is that hip hop is the predominant youth music culture of today. That's not arguable or open to debate, and we're going to get into that. And it's arguably been that for the last 20 plus years. Now, much has been written about hip hop's gritty African American origins in the South Bronx, and how that culture has spread across America like wildfire, lighting up destinations like Houston, LA, and here in Atlanta. But when you spend some time outside of America, like I have, you really begin to see how this once predominantly African American youth form of expression, or as the legendary hip hop group rapper Public Enemy Chuck D called it, Black People CNN, you really get to see how it's really exploded outside of America, where I reside, right? So just like how locally based CNN is broadcast across 212 countries, including Canada, rap music has literally taken root around the world as a primary news source for disenfranchised Asian, South Asian, Latin American, Australasian, African, Middle Eastern, and European publics. Now, both within and outside of North America, hip-hop has truly and genuinely captured the imagination of people from all cultures, all walks of life, races, and that's essentially what formed the crux and thesis of my book, Hip Hop World. Now, I was able to get out, travel different parts of the globe. In Canada, we're able to get a lot of grants, a lot of government grants, a lot of public monies, right, funding to engage our research. And forget about Canada, where I live, or America for a second. I remember going out to Germany, this small town called Essen, E-S-S-E-N. It's a small industrial town in Germany in 2008, and I went out there to check out this large music conference that had a strong hip-hop focus. And, never mind the festival itself, when I arrived at the hotel, I was greeted by the check-in staff, and there was this young 20-something-year-old white male, and he greets me. His English was not great. He was sort of struggling with English. He looked at me. He goes, okay, it's a black guy in this largely pretty much homogenous city called Essen, Germany. And the dialogue, our exchange was starting to get really awkward. And I think that was more a byproduct of linguistic and cultural differences. Anyways, this 20-something-year-old white kid, he starts breaking out into a human beatbox routine. So he starts going like this. He starts doing this to me, right? And I'm like, I just came to check into a non-smoking, king-size bed, single room, and this kid starts doing the human beatbox to me, okay? I have this epiphany, small town in Germany, right? I'm like, whoa, what's going on here? And this was the first country I had hit on my European hip-hop research tour. And some of my research and anecdotes that did not make it into the book Hip Hop World, like this beatbox tale I just told you, how it is when you're doing research, putting together books. So a lot of the stuff ends up on the cutting room floor, a lot of those raw materials. But I will say that after traveling from Essen, Germany, then heading over to Barcelona, and then Sevilla, Spain, and then ultimately finishing off that trip to Paris, and then a city called Rennes, which is just outside of Paris, France. They host this fantastic festival out there called Transmusicale. I began to learn very quickly that hip-hop community members, rappers from elsewhere, Europe in particular, that they were copying and mimicking the rap flows and deliveries of many of the rappers in America, okay? And so while I'm hanging out in Germany, I heard a lot of what I call third-rate sort of Jay-Z copycats, all kinds of poor man's Tupacs in France. And these rappers in Paris in particular, they were literally biting Jay-Z's rap styles like parasites and pit bulls. I also heard the use of the N-word a lot, okay? A lot, all right? And it was mostly coming from non-black rappers, where I was hearing the N-word. And what I quickly found out is, they hear us saying the N-word ad nauseum. They hear us saying it so much here, and they sort of view it, they understand it to be a term of endearment, right? So when Japanese rappers, when I run into Japanese rappers in Shibuya, Tokyo, as part of my research, using the N-word ad nauseum, how do you respond to something like that? All right, how do you respond, right? It's a term of endearment. In America, including Atlanta, we crank it out, right? What rapper from Atlanta is not using the N-word around 24/7, right? So these are some of my findings. So from the Netherlands to New Zealand, 2 other destinations that I visited, I learned that hip-hop is so wildly popular that it's crossing continents and oceans, and the incorporation, appropriation, and wholesale celebration of music, it has really taken shape internationally, right? Far away from its American birthplace, right? Because we observe the South Bronx in New York as being its American birthplace. And also, too, as part of when we talk about, people mimicking copycat mechanisms of what they see happening in America, in North America and America in particular, in some of our research we found in Japan, we started sort of digging in the crates, as hip-hoppers like to say. There was a whole situation happening in Japan many years ago. Despite language barriers, many Japanese youth in the past, what they would do is they would sort of ape African-American rap stylings, including tanning their skin brown, right? So there's a long tradition happening for like 17 years. They tan their skin dark brown to mimic their rap heroes here, all right? They call it ganguro, kind of like a blackface. That loosely interprets the blackface in Japan, right? So when you go there, they say, hey, and then you see these, there are a couple art exhibits and some literature written about ganguro, but they spend so much time mimicking what we're doing here, almost to a point of, tanning their skin black. It's called ganguro. This is what you find hanging out there. All right, and then also too in Cuba, not sure, has anybody here ever been to Cuba by a show of hands? Had opportunity to spend some time there? It's interesting that in Cuba, former President Fidel Castro, he publicly refers to rap music as the vanguard of the revolution. So while we spend an inordinate amount of time here writing raps about popping bottles, hanging out at gentlemen's clubs, and driving fast cars, the rappers in Havana, Cuba, they have little to no interest in writing rhymes about popping bottles and hanging out at gentlemen's clubs. They are doing quite the opposite. They tend mostly to use their art form as a tool of resistance, as protest music. So it's very issues-oriented. It's on the complete opposite end of the spectrum to what we do out here in North America, right? It's protest music, outlaw, rebel music, to protest the living conditions in Cuba and outside of Cuba. It's on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, all right? So if you ever get a chance, check out what's happening in Cuba. And then in France, rap music, sort of mimicking or mirroring what's happening in Cuba, it's considered the unofficial voice of the banlieue. The banlieue is kind of like, we consider like the suburbs, the suburbs of Paris. And they are largely impoverished. We're primarily African and Arab youth. You hear them staging these large anti-racism protests and riots in the past, but they again use it as it's a voice of protest more there. What we found as far as the African and Arab youth. No rhymes. They're less interested, little to no interest in rhyming about popping bottles. Now, from the time I began my research in global hip hop in 2005 to now, what is different between 2005 to now is by the time you hit 2017 and onwards, rap music is now statistically and consistently outselling all other music genres. All right? And that's what all of the mainstream measures of success, like, we have the Billboard music charts, right? We have Spotify and year-end lists. That's what it's telling us, right? So according to Nielsen Music's 2017 year-end report, that's when it really begins as far as the dominance. For the first time ever in 2017, R&B and hip-hop had surpassed rock to become the biggest selling music genre in the US in terms of total consumption. So this is when things really start to take off, 2017, all right? So for the first time since the Nielsen, since they started measuring music consumption in the United States, rock and roll music was no longer the top genre in terms of overall consumption, right? So instead, when you look at we look at music genres, you have jazz, you have blues, you have so-called world music, classical, opera, whatever it is you're into. Hip-hop and R&B, they estimate comprises between 30 to 40% of all music consumption, okay? Despite all of those genres, rock, pop, right? That's a huge deal, since 2017, all right? Now, we're here, you know, it's the 50th anniversary of hip-hop. Rap music has only been around for 50 years, but it is the most important development in popular music in the past half century, right? Again, that's not arguable or open to debate. That's not my opinion. It's basically hard fact backed up, you know, by research. The Royal Society in the UK, they did this comprehensive research study where they looked at things like chart positioning, sounds, textures. They came to this conclusion, and if you look at just streams and sales, hip-hop dominates everything. Now, the question I have for you all out there is, who do you think was the biggest selling musician of 2022? Anyone? Guesses? Little Baby? Okay, over there? Bad Bunny? Okay, that's a good guess. Beyonce? Okay. Little Baby. Yeah, musician.
Rihanna.
Okay, Rihanna. Another good guess, right? All good guesses. Little Baby, Rihanna, Bad Bunny, Harry Styles, right? It's neither. It's not any of those artists, and it's not Nas, it's not Pusha T or Cardi B. It was Drake, okay? So Drake was the biggest selling musician in the US in 2022, okay? Drake from little old Toronto, Canada, all right? And his music was streamed, as far as numbers, 6.7 billion times last year, okay? So Drake was the biggest selling musician in America in 2022. 6.7 billion streams, right? How many people are in the world? What is it, 8 billion? 8 billion people, right? Okay. Now, unless you live in a cave or under a rock or on Mars, or you have cotton permanently crammed into your auditory canal, you would have heard of the rapper Drake. And whether you love or loathe him is irrelevant. What we all cannot deny is his absolute dominance of the music charts, the music industry and hip-hop culture in particular. Now, Drake's, when we talk about outside of the United States, Drake, a rapper from Toronto, Canada, his streaming numbers basically topped Taylor Swift, Bad Bunny, Kanye West, and The Weeknd, who is also from Toronto. And as far as the world, he's actually the third biggest streaming artist in the world in 2022. Now, you'll notice I asked the question, somebody over there said something interesting. I asked you who is the biggest selling musician in 2022. I didn't say rapper. I said the biggest selling musician across genres, right? It was Drake, okay? And, as far as, Drake, who happens to be a rapper from Toronto, he's outselling all the biggest stars, the Bad Bunnies, the Little Babies of the world, the Rihannas, the Beyoncés. He also recently made history by surpassing 75 billion streams on Spotify. And he's the only artist in the history of music to sell that amount, to stream that amount. But never mind last year, 2022. I have another question for you. Who was the best-selling artist in America in 2021? Drake? Anyone else? Any other guesses? Back there? Drake. Anyone else? Okay. Taylor Swift. Okay, good. Taylor Swift. Okay. Okay. So who was the best-selling artist in 2020? Let's keep going. Who do you think was the best-selling artist in 2020 in America?
Are you saying selling? Are you defining selling by streams or by album sales? Because in 2022, Taylor Swift sold the most music in combination of album sales.
Streams.
So you're talking just
Streams,
streams?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Little Baby? Okay. Okay, so the answer is it's Drake, and more Drake, right? 2022, last year, 2021, 2020, as far as streams. Okay, it was Drake. Drake was the biggest selling artist, okay? And so for those of us who have been keeping score, which some of us scholars and documentarians do, like that sister in the back there, I'm glad you're keeping score, right? As far as right, this is what we do. We geek out on this stuff. So Drake essentially stands as the name you'll think of first when we first started getting hip to this idea, 2017 onwards, hip hop and R&B. It's now 35 to 40%, estimated, guesstimated. We're looking at the data as far as all music sales. So a lot of people are pointing to Drake and also to the Weeknd, who's from Toronto. And as of today, Drake is the most streamed artist of all time around the world. Okay? So he's the biggest streaming artist around the world of all time, all right, as of today. Now, I personally knew that the Drake phenomenon was becoming really real, super real, when he began smashing all kinds of sales records that have stood since the 1960s. Records that we thought would never be broken by bands like the Beatles. It's kind of like in basketball, not sure of how many of you have been following the LeBron James situation, right? So he became he scored the most points of all time, surpassing Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, a former center of the LA Lakers. These are records. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's record stood for 38 years, I believe. And these are records that we thought would never fall. The same thing goes for music. The Beatles, they've held records for 55, 60 years that Drake has broken. Drake broke one, recording more top 5 hits in the Hot 100 history than any other artist with 30 versus the Beatles' 29. And he's just annihilating, demolishing all of these records that have stood for 5, 6 decades. Okay? And one significant one he broke was in 2018. He broke the Beatles' 1964 record for most US top 10 hits in a single year, right? So if you hear some critics, scholars, music historians of my persuasion referring to him as the undisputed leader of the new school, with all due respect to Busta Rhymes, Dinko D, and Charlie B, we cannot be blamed, all right? The hard numbers, statistical data, modern day metrics as far as streaming, and actual factuals, it sort of leaves little room for arguments or debate, okay, when we talk about streaming, all right? Now, as far as Drake from Toronto entering the GOAT debate, as far as the greatest musician of all time, these are the types of debates that are happening certainly outside of America, I can tell you. That's where I think I beg to differ as a sort of informal, unofficial Drake scholar, as I think a lot would still need to happen in his career, separate from streams and album sales. For one, if you consider the longitudinal output of some of those others in the GOAT conversations, greatest of all time. For example, Drake's discography, it only consists of 7 studio albums and 4 EPs. And then when you look at someone like Prince, who I consider largely to be one of the top 3 of all time, he had recorded 42 studio albums, right? Including 4 soundtrack albums, 4 live albums, 9 compilation albums, 17 video albums, all right? 42 studio albums. Drake has only recorded 7, right? Also, too, when we look at others, Michael Jackson, another GOAT contender, strong contender in my personal opinion. He had recorded 10 studio albums, 34 compilation albums, and 10 separate studio albums of the Jackson 5, all right? So in these categories, to me, Drake falls short, okay, despite being the #1 selling, artist of all time as far as streams. Now, that's not to say that all of Prince or Michael Jackson's musical output was great. As a certainly not. I mean, I think Prince, despite the 42 studio albums, I think maybe half of them arguably were not. I don't think it had quite the same high artistic integrity, in my humble opinion. And there are just a bunch of other, certainly other variables that certainly come into play. And then when we look at overall output and a musician's ability to make timeless songs and anthems, the question I would pose to you all today is, will we be listening to Drake or DJ Khaled or Lil Baby 10, 20, 40 years from now, right? What do you all think? Is Drake creating timeless music? Do you think we'll be consuming Drake 30 years from now, 50 years from now? Yeah. Okay, yeah? And why do you think that? Let's hear some opinions on that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Yeah, this is interesting feedback because my class, which I taught this morning, it's called Deconstructing Drake and the Weeknd at Toronto Metropolitan University. We had a session this morning, 3-hour session, 8 a.m. And some of the students, they're all Gen Z. They're all, early 20s, late teens. It seems to me that most of the class, they don't seem to think that, despite being of this generation, that his music is going to be timeless like that of Beatles, Bob Marley, Led Zeppelin, Fela Kuti, right? They themselves, which I find quite interesting, right? And they point to some of the songwriting, the subject matter, the lyricism, and they say, no, it's just not the same thing, right? So that's interesting. That's some interesting feedback that I get from the class. Now, while it is I'd say a bit premature to anoint Drake the greatest of all time, given that he is shattering most music industry records, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how did this even come to be? As far as the last 3 years, him being the biggest streaming artist in America. For those of us in here that have been tracking, trailing, documenting the culture for the last couple decades, it was simply not within the realm of hip-hop possibility for a black, Jewish, Canadian kid to be the top dog, right? Drake's father is African-American from Memphis, Tennessee, and his mother is a white Ashkenazi Jew from Toronto, Canada. And in today's hip-hop world, Drake has, he's become this ubiquitous, omnipresent sort of rap unicorn of unicorns, as I like to call him, and a pop culture figure whose influence is broader than Broadway. But how did this come to be? Just the mere fact that the world's leading rapper is a biracial, black, white, Jewish kid from Toronto, Canada, of all places, is sacrilegious to some and a complete blasphemy to others, right? He's not from New York City, one of the acknowledged birthplaces of the art form. He's not from the ATL. He's not from Atlanta, which one could argue is the new mecca of hip-hop, or the absolute epicenter of hip-hop culture and life. Now, what I would argue is no one should be surprised by this development, that the leading rapper of today is from outside of America, is from Toronto, Canada. And the reason I make this argument, I make this case, is that hip-hop has always been a globalized art form from the jump. Okay, so despite its gritty South Bronx American origins, it's always been a globalized art form as far as its inspiration. Before you can discuss any authentic history of hip-hop roots, you have to dig a bit deeper into its genuine origins, and you won't find them here in North America. You will not find them in New York. You will not find them in LA. You will not find them in Atlanta. When people think of Jamaica, where my parents are from, right? I was born and bred in Toronto. My parents are from Jamaica. When people think of Jamaica, they think of Bob Marley. They think of Sean Paul. They think of Shaggy. But hip-hop has Jamaica to thank for its early inspiration, innovation, and artistry. It's the 50th anniversary of hip-hop this year. And the Caribbean region in general supplied hip-hop with its first rapper, Jamaican-born Coke La Rock, right? These are things we need to know as we delve deeper into the culture. It's the 50th anniversary. So the first acknowledged rapper is a Jamaican-born gentleman by the name of Coke La Rock, all right? Hip-hop's first 3 main legendary DJs, we're talking about Barbados-born, right, Grandmaster Flash, okay, who invented the turntablism concept before it had a name, right? Right on over to Africa Bambaataa, who we refer to as the godfather of hip-hop. What's his cultural background? Is he from New York, Atlanta, LA? No. He's from Barbadian and Jamaica. He has Barbadian and Jamaican lineage, okay? Now, when we look now this is where all of the celebrations need to begin and end. The hip-hop's founding father, widely acknowledged founding father, that's not open to debate, is Jamaican-born Kool Herc from Jamaica, all right? And he is the culture's first acknowledged DJ from Jamaica. Without Kool Herc, one could argue that there is no hip-hop. We're not standing here 50 years later, right? And besides Kool Herc, rap's founding father, being Jamaican born and bred, it's interesting that the rapper, when you look at those charts, when people say who is the greatest rapper of all time, who is the greatest rapper of all time in your opinions? Who's the greatest rapper of all time? Who do you think?
It's between Tupac and Biggie.
Okay, it's between Tupac and Biggie, right? And you said that with real, like, it's not even, this is what it is, right? I like the tone with which you said, like, this is who it is. It's Tupac or Biggie. Any other rappers get votes in this? Soulja Boy. Okay, Soulja Boy. Okay, Nas, right? One could make the case Nas. Rakim. Okay, Rakim. Okay, the Soulja Boy. KRS-One. Okay, KRS-One. I'll pretend I didn't hear that Soulja Boy. That's fighting words, you know what I mean? Like, right? Okay, so anyways, back over to you, Harcourt. I mean, so Tupac and Biggie end up near a top, if not at the top of those lists. And here's the thing: the Notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls. He's oftentimes cited by fans and critics alike to be the greatest of all time. And what we began to learn about Biggie is that he spent a lot of time in Jamaica. All right. And he used to spend every summer of his first 16 years of life going, what us Jamaicans saying, going back home to Trelawney, Jamaica, and hanging out with his extended family, including his Jamaican disc jockey, Uncle Dave, who used to play at local area reggae clubs. And this is where Biggie, as you do some research, he learned as far as toasting skills, we say in Jamaica, toasting, DJing, rhyme skills, he's picking a lot of that up in Jamaica, okay, right? The Notorious B.I.G., who many critics, fans, consider to be the greatest of all time. He's getting these skills from Jamaica, right? Yes?
I'm just going to say this and ask it that way.
Yes.
I'm just going to say Heavy D walks so Drake can run.
Okay, okay, thank you. Right, nice. Okay.
Heavy D, he's Jamaican, from Mount Vernon.
That's right. That's right, he is.
He's fair skinned, he got that look, so...
That's right. That's right. Thank you for that. He's like, Heavy D, I'm out. Okay, right? So Biggie, again, yeah, he's hanging out in Jamaica, first 16 years of life, right? And these energies, as far as the sound system culture that the founding father of hip-hop, Kool Herc, right, imported to New York in the late 60s, this is what Biggie's doing, all right? So one could easily argue that if not for Jamaica, there would be no such thing as hip-hop. All right? If I'm telling you that the Holy Trinity of its three leading main DJs that we attribute as being the founding fathers, the godfathers, they're from the Caribbean, and many of them are from Jamaica in particular. All right? So Kool Herc, again, for those of you in here not so familiar, I mean, he immigrated to New York in 1967 from Kingston, and what he brought here to New York and America were Jamaican sound system rituals that were previously unheard of in the U.S. And one of those rituals involved him spinning music on two sets of turntables while an MC or a mic controller, what we now call a rapper, would use this sped-up spoken word style delivery to discuss different subjects on the microphone, all right? Talk about current affairs, talk about the politics of the day, much like a rapper does today. And a lot of the time, the words they put together would rhyme. Okay, so that was one of the functions of those early rappers. You want to make it rhyme. We're talking about current affairs. We're talking about timely topical issues happening in Atlanta, New York, whatever, but we want to make it rhyme. Okay? So if there's no Kool Herc, there's no hip-hop culture. So we can't be surprised, right, that outside of America, the Drake phenomenon, right, things are happening as they are. Also, too, if you stick around or hang around the Caribbean long enough, whether it's involved research family, is anybody here familiar or been to Trinidad and Tobago? Any Trinis in the house? Or people that have been to Trinidad and Tobago, by a show of hands? Who here has visited Trinidad and Tobago? Okay, a couple of you, 3 of you. So if you hang around the Caribbean long enough and you engage some more mild music research, as I have, you'll also see other similar wordsmithing rituals playing out there, right, involving art forms that are very much like rapping that predate, American rap, all right, or how it's articulated in America. So in Trinidad, you have this verbal art form. It's called extempo, okay? And basically, extempo artists in Trinidad, it's basically a rhyming style that has been around since the early 1920s. And the word extempo is a short form for the word extemporize, which essentially means that you are producing something such as a speech or a song without any preparation, right? So it's all improvisation. So in America how we have something called a freestyle rap tradition, right? So I could stand up here and make up a rhyme on the spot. about Georgia State University, about the Department of Africana Studies, right? And make up a rhyme on the spot, right? Pure spontaneity, all improv. So we call it freestyle rhyming. This has been happening in Trinidad and Tobago since the early 1920s. That skill, that art form, right? So when you hang out in Trinidad, you have a lot of elders there, right? If you say, hey, let's talk about the politics of the day, right? The prime minister, corruption, scandal, poverty, issues tied to class positioning, right? They could make up rhymes on the spot, right? Equal to that of the skilled freestyle rappers we have here in America. And they're called extempo artists, all right? So this type of activity is happening in Trinidad, and it predates, it's happening in the 1920s, so predates, we refer to as American hip-hop culture, American rap by 40, 50 years, all right, in Trinidad. This is happening in Trinidad. And then also, too, when we look at the broader hip-hop culture, and we look at some of the elements, as we call them, right, because hip-hop is a culture. Hip-hop is not rap music. They're elements, right? Graffiti art, for those of you that are into visual arts, graffiti art. There's a dance component, b-boying, b-girling, breakdancing, right? We're talking about human beatbox, which I just did a lousy job of copying my friend in Germany, right? I'm not a beatboxer. And we have, right? Right? And we have a DJ culture. So when you look at the broader hip-hop culture, a skill like breakdancing, it has strong African roots in martial arts like Brazilian capoeira. Right? So all of these hip-hop things, all of these rap and hip-hop culture retentions, they're coming from elsewhere, is what I'm saying, right? When we look at the different styles and crews of b-boys and b-girls that were emerging in New York and some parts of Los Angeles in the 1970s, the Latin American and more specifically Puerto Rican, cultural influence and retentions and the creation of most of hip-hop's early dance moves is super undeniable. Right? But it remains underreported, okay? So many of the groundbreaking b-boy crews, people in Toronto, we spend a lot of time on the East Coast in New York. That's where we got our, it's a 1-hour flight. So when you look at a lot of those early breaking b-boy crews and b-girls, Rocksteady crew, New York City Breakers, they were heavily populated with Puerto Rican youth, Caribbean immigrants, and African Americans in the South Bronx, right? People from elsewhere, okay? And the Puerto Ricans in particular, they adopted these Cuban mambo-infused dance styles that influenced a lot of the floor work you saw them doing, right? So you see when the early b-boys and some of the b-girls of Puerto Rican descent, they're doing all the floor routines. These are a direct byproduct of what's happening in the mambo dance scene in Cuba, right? It's Cuban, right? And if you look at all of these, I had at my disposal, I do have actually in my archives, these old audiovisual recordings of Cuban mambo dancers in the 1930s and 40s, it looks just like what hip-hop breakdancers were doing in New York in the 70s, all right? So then, so given all of these examples, I'm jumping around the globe here, right? Paris, France, Germany, Trinidad, Jamaica. Why should anyone in here, or anyone, music enthusiasts, fans, scholars, be startled, dazzled, shocked, annoyed, or confused that the music genre's leading light is Drake, who is from outside America, right? What is it exactly about black histories and herstories that tends to get flipped upside its head over time and ignored and remixed into oblivion and then forgotten about, right? All of these retentions coming from elsewhere. But in America, we claim it as this American thing, right? But I'm telling you that the early b-boys, those are Cuban dance styles, right? Jamaicans, Bajans, Trinis, doing all of this stuff that influences the rap music traditions in America, but they're not from here, right? And it's interesting, in 2016, I wrote a book called Rap and Roll, and it's a collection of essays where I essentially make the case that rap is the new rock and roll, okay? Rap is the new rock and roll, okay? And I essentially make the case that rap is new rock and roll because I was trying to dig deeper into the mainstream of hip-hop culture. And what that meant was asking some tough questions about other historically black musics, like reggae and R&B, and questions tied to cultural appropriation. And what I mean by that is that I go into some of the issues surrounding even the appropriation of many historically black musics like rock and roll, right? In Canada, we have a very rich rock and roll tradition, right? We celebrate this holy trinity, if you're doing, beer drinking, hockey, ice hockey, and rock and roll, okay? So a lot of the most popular, rock music icons, iconoclasts, a lot of them come from Canada, and folk artists too, Joni Mitchell. And it's interesting, whenever any mention of rock and roll comes up in Canada, I'll tell you, people have this sort of caricature in their mind. When you say rock and roll, I'm into rock and roll, this character, their knee-jerk reaction is kind of like this shaggy-haired white guy with a guitar, in Canada, right? Where we crank out, we import rock and roll, punch above our weight, rock and roll. And this is what people think, their knee-jerk reaction. It's a shaggy-haired white guy with a guitar, all right? Now, but the facts are that, some of us in here, we know this, some of the key inventors and innovators of rock and roll, music as we know it today, were black and American, and in some cases female. Okay, so where does this caricature come from? If I say I'm black, I'm into rock and roll, people are like, what are you? This is not our music. What are you doing, Dalton, right? It's this caricature, a white guy with straggly long hair, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? Mostly male, okay? But what we know, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, a gospel music artist who was born in Arkansas in 1915, she recorded a hit song in 1945 called Strange Things Happening Every Day, and this recording has been cited as a precursor of rock and roll, okay? And has been called the first rock and roll record, right? A black woman, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, okay? Early 1900s, right? So when you think rock and roll, right, in the imagination, as far as public perception, you're not thinking of a black woman, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, coming from the gospel music tradition, if I'm talking about rock and roll, And also and she's called the godmother of rock and roll. And, so she was essentially shredding electric guitars, right, long before there was such a thing called rock and roll, 1915, okay? And everyone knows about Elvis Presley, right, the so-called king of rock and roll. And the thing is, in Canada, I don't know as far as when you learn about popular culture and music culture in schools or outside of schools in libraries, right, in your communities, but, during my whole adolescence, middle school, high school, I was not informed that Elvis literally copied and borrowed dance moves and playing styles from African-American performers like Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley. That's just not something I learned in Canada, all right? We just acknowledged him as the king of rock and roll, okay? So there's an interesting interview when we talk about this Arsenio Hall. Did anybody in here grow up watching Arsenio Hall? Old enough to Arsenio Hall, yeah? That's right, exactly, yeah. There was this interview with Little Richard on the Arsenio Hall show in 1990, where Little Richard is essentially making the claim that he's the architect of rock and roll. And I just remember in Canada, at the time, being quite young, and kids sort of essentially ridiculing him, right? Right? He was the butt of jokes, right, in Canada. I'm not sure how you interpreted that interview here. And it was a lot of the non-black kids, the white kids, they thought it was a joke. And they thought that here's this sort of funny guy looking for attention, making these bold claims as being the architect of rock and roll. And, no one told us, we didn't have Wikipedia or the internet back then, that Little Richard had actually recorded an album in 1971 called King of Rock and Roll. So he recorded an album in 1971 called King of Rock and Roll. And we didn't know in Canada that he was a forebear to all kinds of performance styles that white musicians were employing to great fame and fortune, all right? So there's something that happens over time where something starts out this way and then it's virtually unrecognizable, And as far as when we talk about this idea of rap, the way rap is interpreted when we say rap is the new rock and roll, Kanye West, right, he's on this kind of, hate tour. He's saying a bunch of outrageous things, anti-black things, anti-Jewish things. Slavery was a choice. Producing clothing lines, White Lives Matter tees, sweat tops, and hoodies, saying a lot of hurtful rhetoric about black people and our histories. He actually had claimed that rap is the new rock and roll. He said this many years ago, and people thought he had lost his mind. He said that rap is the new rock and roll. We the new rock stars, and I'm the biggest one of all of them. He said that I'm the number one rock star on this planet. Right? So when he said that, people thought he had lost his mind, right? But both music forms, rap and rock and roll, they're both invented by black people, and much like rock music or the blues, these music forms, they used to be called the devil's music by parents of teenagers that listened to it, right? And I remember growing up in Toronto listening to rap music, in the 70s and 80s, and my mother, my proud Jamaican mother, she used to say, turn off that noise. It was noise. She didn't consider it to be music, right? She said, turn off that noise. When I attended York University in Toronto, the first book I read, a scholarly book tied to hip-hop culture, was called Black Noise by Professor Trisha Rose. And the book is called Black Noise, because this is what it was considered back then, right? My Jamaican parents said, turn off that noise. I want to listen to some real music. I want to listen to classical music, right? I want to listen to opera. I want to listen to jazz, not rap music, right? This is noise. It's black noise, right? Now, just to wrap up shortly, as hip-hop has grown up and left the hood, one of the questions we continually ask ourselves is, we saw, did any of you all watch the Grammy Awards the other day, by show of hands, Grammy Awards? Okay, right? So Dr. Dre, he won a big award, a Global Impact Award. Dr. Dre, one of the founding members of NWA, one of the greatest hip-hop music producers of all time, he is a billionaire, okay? And we see that now our culture, hip-hop culture, there are billionaires in our culture. Kanye West was a billionaire. I don't think he is now because he lost, the Adidas sponsorships, what have you. But we have full-fledged billionaires. We suspect that Drake and the Weeknd from Toronto will become billionaires. So one of the questions we continue to ask ourselves is, will these wealthy, moneyed hip-hop community performers still be able to sing the blues or authentically, rap about the so-called hood when they don't reside anywhere near the hood anymore and are full-grown adults, right? Or when some of the conditions that created rap have drastically changed, right? When I say that it's a hip-hop world and you all are just living it, what I also mean is that one part of rap's appeal lies in its appeal to the broadest possible spectrum of audiences in a way that other popular music or classical music just don't, okay? Underneath the hip-hop umbrella lies all of these interesting subgenres that you see sort of take flight in other cities, other countries, other destinations, right? What I found hanging out in the Middle East, for example, and some of the religious sensibilities out there, if you're Jewish and or born-again Christian, Palestinian from Israel, right? There are these large factions of, as far as klezmer rap, rap music influenced by, the culture, the faith, Judaism, klezmer music traditions, right? This is what you find happening, all of these sort of subgenres, right? This gentleman came out to one of my book launches, Hip Hop World. His name is Leroy Moore, and he's the chief proponent behind a scene called a Crip Hop movement, okay? Crip Hop, which is catered to rap practitioners with disabilities who rap about their experiences, okay? When I was last out in New Zealand, I actually stumbled into this film called Hip Hoperation, and it's about these 80-year-old seniors in New Zealand, right, who competed in this Las Vegas dance championships, and they're 80 plus years old, they're seniors, okay? So when we talk about hip-hop having grown up and left the hood, it's not a culture that is singularly, despite the public perception that it's singularly consumed by teens and 20-somethings and by black people, racialized communities, Latin American communities. No, that's not the case when you travel outside America at all, okay? And what I would say is one of the most interesting and transformative elements I see in the culture actually has to do with language, okay? Both in and outside of America. If you pay attention to how youth speak nowadays, including my students at Toronto Metropolitan University, you will have noticed that, youth culture, my students, they're speaking what sounds like almost a different language unto itself, okay? I was joking about it actually with my friends from Atlanta. Kids in Toronto, right? They're speaking this kind of combination of African-American vernacular English. It's kind of Ebonics. It's influenced by Jamaican slang. It's influenced by Jamaican nation language, right? Jamaican patois nation language, right? And they put it all in this pot. And some of it's almost like a language unto itself. It's like a new rap slanguage, okay? And years ago when I was doing research into this, kind of like I'm teaching and these kids are saying all these slang terms that I can't quite identify with, we noticed that there are all these, urban, hip-hop dictionaries now, right? Like there's this book called the Hip-Hoptionary, right? Which is a combination of hip-hop and dictionary. There are all these hip-hop dictionaries. It's almost like it's a language unto itself. This is what's happening now as far as hip-hop, right? And in Toronto, hip-hop youth, they almost speak their own form of hip-hop fueled influenced language that is heavily influenced by the local Jamaican culture and the East African culture there too, all right? Now, just to wrap up, there are all kinds of myths and stereotypes about rap music that us experts, we like to spend a lot of time debunking. I was hanging out at the Consular General of Canada's office yesterday, And it was interesting, we were just talking about culture, and about, I was sort of asking him about what's the demographic profile African Americans, what's the black community look like here as far as numbers, statistics, right? Coming from a city like Toronto, which is the most multicultural city in the world. And it was interesting, the first, when I was writing for The Source magazine as a journalist, the first essay I wrote was actually about this, as far as the white rap phenomenon, right? Because at the time, I had interviewed a bunch of rappers, Kid Rock, who was out of Detroit. His roots are from Detroit as a rapper. Many people know him today as a folk musician. MC Search from a New York-based rap duo called Third Base. That issue about white rappers that had come out, it had sold like hotcakes, Eminem was on the cover, all right? And it was interesting that we were talking about like who, at the time, who are Eminem's biggest fans? Like, who's consuming Eminem? Is it black youth? Is it black people? Is it Latin American youth, Latinx? Right? Is it people from, United Nations, Middle East, Asian, South Asian? Who is consuming Eminem? And one of my old Source colleagues, Bakari Katwana, he actually had written a book back then in 2005. It's called Why White Kids Love Hip Hop: Wanksters, Wiggas, Wannabes, and the New Reality of Race in America. And the question I have for you, we're going to put some trivia, all right? And the winners, you get some free tickets to a concert in Toronto. No, I'm joking. But who is the biggest selling rapper of all time? Who do you think is the biggest selling rapper of all time? Guesses? MC Hammer, okay, Eminem. Biggest selling rapper of all time? Okay, it's probably Eminem, right? You are correct, right? The biggest selling rapper of all time is Eminem, by a country mile, right? He's a white guy from Detroit, right? He's not from a hood, low-income neighborhood that is largely, he's a white guy from Detroit, Another question for you, some rap trivia. What's the first rap group to go to #1 on the Billboard charts? The first rap group to go to #1 on the Billboard charts. Okay, Beastie Boys? Run DMC. Okay, good guess. Anyone else? First rap group to go to #1 on the Billboard charts. Grandmaster Flash 35. Okay, good guesses, right? It's the Beastie Boys, right? 3 Jewish white guys from New York. Okay? Biggest selling rapper of all time. It's a white guy from Detroit. The first rap group to go to #1 on the Billboard charts. 3 white guys that happen to be Jewish from New York, right? What was the first rap single to top the Billboard charts? Ice Ice Baby? Anyone else? What's the first big blockbuster rap single to top the Billboard charts? License to Ill, okay. Beastie Boys, right? Okay. Oh, sorry? Battle it out to see who's the best turntablist, right? Within that, you're going to find a lot of Filipino community members that are dominating that art form, okay? Filipino, not Puerto Rican, Filipino, all right? And there's actually a whole hit to that. A couple he said that their dexterity is manipulating the turntables, all right? And a question I'm always asking, right? China, okay? China, right? In the 1980s. In North America, so we had these films like Beat Street and Breakin' 1 and 2. Some of us older, we remember seeing these films. Like anything else, it was sort of overexposure of breakdancing. It actually crippled breakdancing's ability to be taken seriously as a lucid art form in North America. So as the media attention faded on breakdancing, it went back underground in the US and then got rebirthed outside of the country, okay? So in Europe, South America, and Asia, breakdancing, it never really died or took a backseat to rapping. Right? So when you go outside of America, B-boys, B-girls, they're not just into the rap music, right? They're into the dancing, the turntablism, the graffiti art, like the full culture, the full hip-hop culture, all right? And by the early 90s, the dance scene was regenerated throughout Europe, and that's where the largest dance competitions were originated, where they are developed, and where they are staged, right? So there's this dance competition that happens outside of America. It happens in Europe. It's called Battle of the Year, and a B-Boy Summit, and the annual Battle of the Year competition, for those of you all that are into dance, the dance part of hip-hop culture, the B-boying and B-girling, it basically rotates around different countries in Europe, and it is the single largest gathering of dancers, right, of hip-hop dancers, and you get dancers coming in from, some 23-odd countries, attendance is 60,000. And basically, though, since 2008, a Korean, Japanese, or Chinese crew has won every single year this competition, right? Which gathers all the world's best dancers, hip-hop dancers from around the world. The winners have all mostly come from, since 2008, Japan, Korea, and China. Okay? This is what's happening when we talk about hip-hop culture, right? Now, to wrap up, we're going to wrap up with a little Drake. Now, Drake, being from Toronto, being Jewish, black, biracial, from Toronto, Canada, from outside of America, he has clearly thrown a wrench in the projections and predictions and the plans of the modern-day hip-hop critic and scholar, right? Because he's sort of living his life as this sort of hybridized rapper, you know? All of these things going on. His father's from Memphis, mother from Toronto, right? He's biracial, bicultural. Is Drake black or white? Is he Jewish? Is he Catholic? Is he Canadian, American? Is he rich or poor? In a modern world, we would demand that he choose, right? But in a postmodern world, we can embrace a cultural mosaic of Drake as an individual without forcing him to make a choice in claiming one racial or cultural identity. And this willingness to accept contradiction is very distinctive of this sort of postmodernism when we talk about diversity. Rap music has always traditionally fetishized authenticity and keeping it real, all right? This idea of keeping it real. As hip-hop culture has moved toward a comfortably mainstream center, right? What does it mean for an artist to be authentic, right? An artist like Drake who claims to write music based on personal experiences, you know, but what exactly does that mean? If you're black, if your dad is black from Memphis, Tennessee, your mother is white and Jewish from Toronto, right? What exactly does that mean, right? Are you upper, are you lower class, are you American, are you Canadian? There's a lot going on there. And today's popular music, it tends to be obsessed and fixated on consumerism, I would say. And, you know, in closing, what I would like to say, or what I'd like to suggest to you is that Drake is essentially what we consider to be the first modern day rapper to fully capitalize on this idea of cultural hybridity, right? To appeal to vastly larger audiences, as we can trace through his streams, him being the #1 streaming artist in America in 2022. Drake's bricolage of complex and intersectional identities and his unique privilege to choose to identify with different marginal communities essentially allows him to fully capitalize economically on the shared experiences and struggles of different cultural, national, class backgrounds, right? Drake does a great job of alluding to different cultures, locations, and social identities through his music and videos to construct his place as a rapper in the music industry that articulates this sort of liminal, hybridized identity as an authentic black rapper. He is black identified, but he's also Jewish, right? He's American because his father's from Memphis, Tennessee, but he's also Canadian, right? He's working class, but also started from the bottom, now I'm here, right? So he sort of plays around with this class positioning, right? He's all over the place, all at the same time. So for example, in simple terms, when you consider the Jewish community, I can tell you in Toronto, for certain, Jews in Toronto love Drake, all right? The Jewish community look to him as a demigod, all right? Why? Because he puts it out there that he's Jewish, right? And no Jewish performers working on this scale do that, right? In his videos, he has a video called HYFR, Hell Yeah Effin' Right. Have any of you all seen that video? Okay, Hell Yeah Effin' Right. HYFR is the acronym. And in the video, he documents his bar mitzvah rites of passage. You know, it's a rites of passage ceremony that young Jewish males undergo. And he essentially shoots a video in a traditional Jewish house of worship, right? He shoots the video, for those of you that haven't seen it, the video is shot in a shul, in a synagogue, okay? This is where he shot his video. So Jews, the Jewish diaspora, Jews in Toronto, they love Drake. They're like, this guy shot a rap video in a house of worship, in a Jewish house of worship, in a shul, in a synagogue, right? And nobody would even think to do that, right? Nobody would even think to do that. Americans, you all, right here who are American, you all love Drake, okay? Because he was co-signed and signed by one of the most celebrated American rappers, right, of all time, from New Orleans, Lil Wayne, right? He was signed to Cash Money Records, okay? So Americans love Drake. They love his origin story, right? He was signed to Cash Money Records at a time when Lil Wayne was the #1 rapper in America. Also, too, Americans also, too, love Drake because his dad is from Memphis. And his dad is, as far as Drake's musical lineage, his dad used to play drums for the rock icon Jerry Lee Lewis, his uncle Larry Graham, right? Because I'm into the music thing. I used to roller skate. I grew up on the funk. And Larry Graham, his uncle, is the guy that innovated that slap bass guitar routine. You know when you play the bass guitar and you slap it, the boom, 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 boom. It's Larry Graham, his uncle, that invented and innovated that bass guitar technique, right? Larry Graham, Drake's uncle. And then he has other uncles we know that played with Sly and the Family Stone, and also Teenie Hodges, another uncle. He helped write 12 of Al Green's million-selling singles, right? So his bloodlines are strong in America, right? He has these three uncles. Larry Graham, who used to, the bass guitar routine. Larry Graham also mentored Prince, right? So Drake's uncle was a mentor to Prince, the late Prince, right? They were both a part of the Jehovah's Witness. So his uncle mentored Prince. Another uncle played with Sly and the Family Stone. Another uncle wrote, big selling songs with Al Green. Okay, so that's why Americans love Drake. And then now Canadians love Drake because he's constantly flag waving his love for Toronto, right? Even going as far as to name himself the Six God, right? Toronto is affectionately referred to as the Six, both within Toronto, throughout the rest of Canada, and around the world. They say you're from the Six. Okay, so Canadians love him, right? And also, too, when it comes to a popular culture, basketball culture, Drake is attached to our local area NBA team that won the NBA championship of 2019, the Toronto Raptors, right? So he works as a global ambassador for our NBA basketball franchise, the Toronto Raptors, right? That won the championship in 2019. Now, as far as black folk, it's Black History Month, right? Black folk love Drake because he collaborates with most of the best black rap artists of today, including many from Atlanta, okay? Future, 21 Savage, right? His last recording was a collaborative project with 21 Savage, okay? So he collaborates with a lot of Atlanta artists, right? Drake also, too, self-identifies as being black, okay? Despite the American, Canadian, Jewish black thing, he self-identifies as being black. And he almost also, too, we sort of joke about this back home in Toronto, he almost singularly seems to date attractive black women. Okay, so if you look at his dating patterns, my students, they always bring this up. Who's he dating now? Who's he dating this week? Though the mother of his child is neither black nor Jewish. She's French, right? So at the end of the day, Drake disrupts this notion of a fixed identity in much of his music and artistic output, and he does a great job of illustrating his cultural, national, and class backgrounds to appeal to essentially everybody, right? If you want to talk about, low-income situations, class positioning, low-income folk love Drake. Why? Because Drake, in his videos, he has a video called God's Plan. Not sure if you all had an opportunity to see that. So in the video, he's playing Mr. Philanthropist, altruism, right? And he's giving out all this free money. He pays for a young lady to go to college, right? He has another song called Starting from the Bottom, right? Starting from the bottom, now I'm here, right? Right? That's why low-income communities, they're like, this guy started from the bottom like us. That's all now open to debate, whether he actually did start from bottom. But low-income communities love Drake as well, right? And he also puts out videos. He has a video called Worst Behavior that he put out about 10 years ago, where what he's doing, he's hanging out in Memphis, Tennessee, and he's showing, he does a great job of trying to show his working class roots in the United States, where most of his family lives, right? And the imagery in the video, if you play close attention to that video, the imagery he surrounds himself with, its deteriorating buildings marked by graffiti to articulate the poverty in Memphis, and he sort of uses these signifiers to sort of situate himself and his narrative as being aligned, attached to lower class members of society, right? Okay, as being poor. Though Drake's connection to his father and to his other relatives in Memphis, what he does is he exploits those blood relationships, what I'd say, right, is to signify a sense of belonging to Memphis communities, right? And so what I would say in the end is that Drake's popularity is almost contingent on the selling and shilling of this hybridity, right? Hanging out in low-income communities, right? Hanging out, shooting videos in Jewish houses of worship, right? Hanging out with black community members. It's almost contingent on that, right? And through his lyrics, Drake, he connects to different communities by creating these shared experiences that we can all enjoy, wherever you're coming from, right? If you're American, Canadian, everything in between, we have this feeling of belonging, right? As opposed to feeling othered when we listen to his music. Drake has achieved a sense of mastery in this area as he loosely identifies with all kinds of different communities, and every difference is seen as an opportunity for marketing and consumer consumption, right? So by carrying these multiple identities within the media, his videos, his songwriting, his lyrics, he's able to relate to so many different cultural traditions and practices without being forced to assimilate to one or homogenize his entire identity, all right? So this tactical organization of his identity, it essentially enables Drake to transcend any constructed borders around racial, social, class distinctions, right? He's able to unify different populations through his artistic output, okay? Now, I think just in closing thoughts, in this new hip-hop world, that's the name of the book, where I spent some time outside of the country, outside of Canada, so North America. I do argue that this postmodern hybridized identities, I think it's going to become more the norm than the exception. These type of Drake figures that are like, bicultural, biracial, right? Product of different faiths, Catholicism, Jewish, all of this is going to become more the norm than the exception. And I don't think it's going to become so easy to identify a rapper, for example, as being from Atlanta, right? And all of the cliches that follow suit because you're from Atlanta. I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of this. And many older rap critics, I'm a Generation X, born in the 70s. A lot of people, I'd say 40 plus, they're complaining, whining on social media. I'm pretty active on social media. They're saying that, modern day rap music is dead, and they are continuing to long for a so-called golden era when rap felt more pure and real to them, more authentic. Keep it real, right, that slogan. And what I would argue in closing to counter that is that, hip-hop is not dead, rap music is not dead, it's not dying. It's just gone global, right? And the West, the West, North America, might not always be where it's at, okay? In fact, it can be argued that one of the only ways hip-hop culture will survive is if it embraces globalization, right? So I'm giving you all these anecdotes as far as the best dancers, dancing crews, B-boys, B-girls, they're not here. They're still dancing, right? While we sort of sloughed aside. We don't pay strict attention to b-boying, b-girling like they do in Europe and Asia, right? Right? So this is one way, this is how we preserve parts of the culture. It's embracing, right, globalization. And when I had interviewed Public Enemy's Chuck D back in 1998, he sounded eerily prophetic. He told me, he said, and I quote, "To me, hip-hop has never been about selling records to people 12 to 18 years old in the eastern part of the US. It's much bigger than that. Hip-hop has always had Latin, Caribbean, European, and African influences, so its reach into the outer reaches of the world outside of the West was inevitable and is not entirely new." Okay? This is something Chuck D told me in 1998. And I also think that one small part of being a successful member of the creative industries, or if you're an educator of today, you have to have this ability to project, to look ahead, to predict trends before they happen, right? Tap into your powers of prognostication and sort of make these bold predictions. This is what I did in 2009. I literally predicted that Drake is going to be a leading figure in the culture, right? All of the early signs were there, right? So the question I have for you, and we're going to open it up for a question and answer, if you have any questions tied to Drake and hip-hop outside North America, the question I would ask to you is, do you feel that rap is dying, that hip-hop culture is dying, right? Do you believe that it has morphed into something else, right? Far distant and separate from what it was in the 70s, 50 years ago, right? We know that a lot of music genres they die. House music. Does anybody here know house music? We're into house music, my generation. I was into house music, right? Is house music as big a thing now as it was back then, right? Grunge music out of Seattle, right? I spent some time in Seattle. Where is grunge music at today, right? Is grunge music as popular as it once was when Kurt Cobain and Nirvana were doing their thing, right? Jungle, UK, right? A lot of us, yes, sorry? Yes, drum and bass, right? We know that music genres, right? They don't stay peak popularity, right? They come and go. They come and go in waves, right? Some outright disappear, right? Disco, is anybody here, or, listen, disco? Where did disco go, right? Right? So do you all think that rap is dying? Do you also think, that has rap music lost its edge, right? Is it still, to you in America and Atlanta, where we are today, is it still rebel music? Is it outlaw music tied to social protest? Its roots, is it outlaw music, right? And who's listening to rap music today, right? Who's streaming Jack Harlow, right? White rapper that gets big streams, right? Comparable to an Eminem. Who is streaming Jack Harlow? Who's consuming the music now, right? Is it black people from the hood, low-income origins, Puerto Ricans, Latin? Who's consuming the music, right? And these are all things worth pondering in this new hip-hop world. Okay, thank you.